All right, so let's take a look at our fertilizer sources of sulfur. This is not a comprehensive list. These are the ones that I run into most often. The first one is elemental sulfur. So this is straight sulfur. It's about 95% sulfur. And this can be a great tool, but we need to realize that that elemental sulfur needs to break down. So it is fairly slow in its availability. It can typically, if you apply in the fall, a lot of that will be available the next summer, but we're not going to apply it and have it come available immediately. We're going to see things like ammonium sulfate, potassium sulfate. So ammonium sulfate is 210024, and how you read these, that's your percent nitrogen, percent phosphorus, percent potassium, percent sulfur. So 21% nitrogen, 24% sulfur. Fairly fast releasing form. When I'm doing sulfur research, I usually use ammonium sulfate. It's a lot easier to work with. When I'm doing small plot work, I will actually dissolve spray grade ammonium sulfate in about 20 gallon per acre solution. Sometimes I'll go 30 gallon per acre depending on the rate, but I can typically put out 20 pounds of sulfur, so that's about 88 pounds of ammonium sulfate through a 20 gallon per acre solution. It doesn't look like it's going to dissolve, but it eventually dissolves out. So it's a very fast releasing, because remember, that sulfate form is what the plant's looking for. So we basically just have to separate these two out, which happens readily in the soil. We do get some nitrogen here. So if you're looking at a soybean plant, it will still take up that nitrogen. We'd rather it do it through producing a nodule. That nodule has bacteria that create nitrogen in the nitrate form out of nitrogen gas. But the soybeans will take that up, corn will take it up, no problem. So depending on when you apply this, we won't really be wasting any of the nitrogen portion. But if you are doing a fall application of this, it's probably not recommended, because we've got a lot in that sulfate form, and there's a potential to lose that with that gravitational movement of water through the soil, so it'll basically leach out. There will be some decent carryover, but this is typically in season. Potassium sulfate doesn't get used as much as ammonium sulfate. It is a good form. So we got 17% potassium, we've got 17% sulfur. Just like the ammonium sulfate, it's in that sulfate form. It's available quickly for the plant, so good for in season. Calcium sulfate's another form of sulfur. You might know this better as gypsum. It varies in its analysis, so when you're buying that product, you'll need to ask what the analysis of that is. Again, it's pretty fast to release because we are in the sulfate form. It's bonded to calcium, so it's a little harder to break than some of these other ones, but it happens pretty quickly in the soil. Thiazole is one that is used in a lot of liquid fertilizer to introduce sulfur, whether it's in a starter or a post-applied application. It's 12% nitrogen, 26% sulfur, but it's in the thiosulfate form. So that needs to break down before it will go into the sulfate form and be available for that plant. So it's not necessarily as fast as the forms where it's already in the sulfate form, but in warm soils it does occur pretty quickly. The one thing to remember, well, there's a couple things to remember on thiazole. Number one is the thiazole and then the intermediate product it breaks down into before it goes into the sulfate form. Both of those have the potential for risk of loss, similar to sulfate. So they will leach through the soil. So if we do make that application and we get a heavy rainfall event, there's a pretty good chance that this may not get converted over, or if it does start that process, both of those could be leached out of the root zone. Thiazole is also pretty hard on germinating seeds, so it's got a decently high salt index. It can inhibit germination. So I've seen it used in a pop-up in really low rates, but you really need to manage how much you're going to be putting in. It's better to go in a 2x2 with thiazole. Last one we talked a little bit about is manure. That is one that varies in its analysis. Like I said, poultry and swine are higher in sulfur, dairy and beef are lower, but you really need that analysis. And again, this is going to be slow, just like that organic matter. So all that sulfur is tied up for the most part in organic form. There is some sulfate sulfur that's quick release, but it does need to break down. So we will see kind of a slow release of manure. Typically a fall applied manure, you're going to get half that sulfur out of that organic form that's going to become available, will be available the next year. So you can count on about half of that sulfur. All right, so we will cover final thoughts. So the first one is, do I need sulfur? And the answer is maybe. We're going to have to go out, we're going to have to test the soil, and we're looking again less than 2% organic matter and less than 15 CEC. If we get below those levels, that's where we're going to trigger that sulfur application. One thing I will comment on is these are what you use to drive your sulfur decision. You don't use the sulfur report that you get on your soil test. That test looks literally for the sulfur that's currently available in the sulfate form in the soil. So depending on the time of the year, depending on how that sample is taken, you may not get an accurate representation of the sulfur that's available, and you're also not going to account for any of the sulfur that's in the organic matter in the soil. So it's good to see a snapshot of what's currently available, but you're not going to get an accurate reading on the total amount of sulfur that will be available for that plant. So you use the organic matter in the CEC. When we're thinking about in season and trying to figure out, do we need sulfur, do we not need sulfur, a good way to manage that is, if we're below 2%, we've got a pretty good chance. If we're above 4%, we've got a pretty weak chance of getting an economic response. But in those in-between zones, so if you're in that 2 to 3% organic matter, you can't go out and tissue test in season. And this is a decent way to go assess certain areas. So if we jump back to our field, I may plan on hitting these high spots with sulfur fertilizer, and I may go back and tissue test these intermediate zones in season and see if we do have a sulfur deficiency showing up in that corner soybeans. I'm going to come back and hit those zones with a foliar application or an application of ammonium sulfate. Now, this is getting pretty hard to manage if we're thinking about just coming in to spray a couple of zones. So that's something where you need to sit down and really work through that plan in season. If you're doing your own application, it's a lot easier. If you're working with a fertilizer rep, it's going to be tougher to get that taken care of depending on how big of a zone it is. If half your field is low in sulfur and half your field is in this transitional, that's a lot easier way to manage than if you're in one of these situations where you're just all over the board in the field. The last thought on sulfur, get out and scout. There's no other way to figure this out than to actually get out in your fields, do your soil testing, do your tissue testing, look for sulfur deficiency. It's going to look similar to nitrogen, so you're going to get that yellowing of the leaves, but it will happen on the upper parts of the plant, where nitrogen deficiency is going to happen on the lower parts of the plant. So get out, test, scout. If you aren't sure if you're going to see a response or not, it's pretty easy to mix up some ammonium sulfate and go out and put a couple strips across the field and see if you do see a response or not. So hopefully this was beneficial. I'm going to try to make a few more of these as we get into the season. I'll jump back into Facebook Live, especially when I'm out in the field if I come across something great to talk about. So have a good day, and hopefully this was helpful.